Pittsburgh, July 23, 1892. Second floor. A man is sitting at his desk, finishing the afternoon's work. He has been shot twice. He will be shot again in approximately 30 seconds. He does not know this. What he knows is that there is a document in front of him that needs his signature, and a wound in his neck that is beginning to bleed seriously, and a carpenter somewhere behind him who is beating another man on the head with a hammer, and a doctor who has just been called and will need to spend 2 hours extracting bullets, and a statement he has already decided he is going to make to the press before he goes home. The statement will be 26 words. This is a story about what a man can contain. Henry Clay Frick was, depending on who you ask and when you ask them, a monster, or a visionary, or a coke king, or a ruthless anti-union operator, or a grieving father, or one of the greatest art collectors in American history. He was the man who broke the Homestead strike, and the man who built the Frick collection. He was the man who presided over the Morewood massacre, and the man who left his Fifth Avenue mansion with its Vermeers and its Rembrandts and its rooms full of light to the public. All of these were the same man. The question this script will ask, and then refuse to answer cleanly, is this: what does it mean to leave the world something beautiful when you built it on something that wasn't? The art is real. The beauty is real. The blood is also real. The names of the dead are also real. Silas Wayne, John Morris, Joseph Sotak, Peter Ferris, Henry Striegel, Thomas Weldon, George Rutter. 7 men, July 6th, 1892. We are going to say their names. We are going to say what the collection is worth. And then we are going to ask the question and leave it open. Because the only honest answer is that both things are true simultaneously, and they do not resolve. He grew up watching the wrong side of the family have money. His grandfather, Abraham Overholt, was a Mennonite distiller who owned the One Street village of West Overton in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. The distillery, the farmland, the store, the whole apparatus of a small but thriving rural enterprise. His father, John Frick, worked as a hand at his father-in-law's distillery and later scratched out a near subsistence living as a farmer. The Overholt side of the family lived in relative opulence. The Frick side watched. Young Clay, as he was called, both resented and emulated Abraham Overholt. The resentment is easy to understand. The emulation shaped everything that came after. He was 14 when he started clerking at his Uncle Christian Overholt's store in West Overton. 2 years later, he moved to Mount Pleasant, still clerking for another uncle. He had minimal formal education. A year at Otterbein College in Ohio, a year at nearby Westmoreland College. But he was doing the real education himself, in the books. Not literature, not philosophy, the actual books, the ledgers, the inflows, the outflows, the cash circulatory system of a business, which fascinated him in a way that nothing else did. His handwriting was, by all accounts, almost artistic. The books were kept with a precision that impressed everyone who saw them. When his grandfather Abraham died in 1870, leaving 10% of his estate, roughly $40,000, to Clay's mother and nothing directly to Clay himself, the thing that had been building since childhood finally had a target. He told his sister Maria, "Oh, I'll be worth $200,000 someday." The next year, at 21, he borrowed $75,000 against his mother's share of her father's estate and went into the coke business with his cousins. He would later approach Judge Thomas Mellon for additional capital as he expanded, were turning again and again as each new tranche of coal land became available at distressed prices. The business grew loan by loan, acquisition by acquisition, through a financial panic that ruined everyone around him. Coke is coal that has been purified. You take coal, the rich bituminous coal of the Connellsville seam, a 60-mile-long field of the best metallurgical coal in the country, and you fire it in a beehive oven for 48 hours in an airless chamber. The sulfur burns off, the phosphorus burns off, the rest of the impurities burn off. What remains is nearly pure carbon. Coke, the fuel that runs blast furnaces, the fuel that turns iron ore into steel. The beehive ovens were 12 feet in diameter and 7 feet high. The men who worked them, coke pullers, fed coal in, waited 48 hours, then drew the finished coke out in intense heat. They were paid by the oven, approximately $1.50 to $2.25 a day. 12-hour shifts every day of the week, approximately $10 a week. But the wages are only the beginning of the story, and not even the most important part of it. The workers at Frick's coke operations in the 1870s and 80s did not simply receive a low wage. They lived inside a system designed to ensure that the wage never actually reached them as usable money. This is what company towns were for, and it is worth understanding exactly how they worked, because the company town is the template for everything that comes later in this story. The housing in a Connellsville company patch belonged to the company. The store, the only store within practical reach of the workers, belonged to the company. Wages were paid not in currency, but in scrip, printed tokens, redeemable only at the company store, worth precisely what the company decided they were worth, and worthless everywhere else. If you worked for Frick in 1878 and you drew your week's scrip and walked to the company store, you could buy flour and salt pork and lamp oil and boots. What you could not do was save it. You could not take it to a bank. You could not use it to buy land elsewhere. You could not accumulate it into anything that belonged to you rather than to the company that had issued it. The company store was not a convenience. It was a mechanism. Prices at company stores ran consistently higher than at independent merchants in nearby towns that workers in company patches had limited access to and limited time to reach. The arithmetic of the system ensured that most workers spent approximately what they earned, week after week, returning their wages to the company through the store. Some ended the week in debt to the company, which meant the following week's work was already obligated before it began. And if you got sick, if an accident at the oven burned your hands badly enough that you could not draw coke for a month, you lost your wages and your housing simultaneously. The house went with the job. A worker who could not work had no income, and within a short time, no roof. There was no sick pay, there was no insurance. There was no mechanism within the system to protect a worker from the consequences of the work itself. Frick did not invent this system. He inherited it from the existing coal patch culture of southwestern Pennsylvania, and then perfected it. By 1880, he controlled approximately 80% of the state's coke production. That dominance was built not just on the efficiency of his ovens, but on the total economic control his company patches exercised over the people who worked them. Workers could not easily leave. They owed rent. They owed the store. They had scrip that was worthless outside the patch. The company town was not merely an economic arrangement. It was a total environment of control. This is what makes Homestead comprehensible. When workers at the Homestead Steel Mill fought for their union in 1892, they were fighting against the expansion of a system that most of them could already see operating just up the road in the Connellsville coal fields. They had watched what happened to organized workers in Frick's coke patches. They knew what he built, and they knew what he did when workers tried to change it. By 1880, Frick had 1,000 ovens producing approximately 9,000 tons of coke a day. He was not yet 30 years old. He was worth over $1 million. He was also, quietly, already buying pictures. Not for Mears, not yet. In the early 1880s, when he was newly wealthy and still expanding his coke empire, Frick was purchasing Barbizon School landscapes, French pastoral paintings that were fashionable among American collectors of the period and considerably more affordable than old masters. He bought works by Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, whose misty river views and silver-toned forests were among the most sought-after paintings in American collecting circles at the time. He bought works by Jean-François Millet, the painter best known for The Gleaners, that image of peasant women bent over a harvested field, gathering what the harvest machines had left behind. Millet painted labor. He painted the people at the bottom of the agricultural economy with a tenderness that made their poverty visible and dignified simultaneously. Whether Frick saw any of that in what he was buying is not recorded. A loan officer had reported to Judge Mellon in 1873. "Give him the money. Land's good, ovens well built, manager on job all day, keeps books evenings. Maybe a little bit too enthusiastic about pictures, but not enough to hurt. Knows his business down to the ground." Maybe a little bit too enthusiastic about pictures. In 1873, before there was any indication that the pictures would become anything more than a young man's hobby. Hold on to that line. We will come back to it. When the financial panic of 1873 hit and his competitors began selling their ovens and their coal land at distressed prices, Frick was up at 3 in the morning monitoring his coke production, and at 10 in the morning soliciting orders in Pittsburgh, and back in Connellsville at night doing the books. He bought everything he could at prices others were desperate to accept. He was the coke king. What his workers were was considerably less than kings. The pattern in his coke patches was consistent. Wages were cut, workers struck, private force was used to end the strike, and no one was ever charged. This pattern would repeat with escalating violence until it produced something that neither the workers nor the industrialists had quite anticipated. January 1891. 17 months before the Homestead strike begins. This is where the story really starts. An explosion at Frick's Mammoth Mine in the southwestern Pennsylvania coke region killed 109 men and boys. 109. They were buried, many of them, in a mass grave at St. John the Baptist Cemetery just south of Scottsdale, Pennsylvania. Their names are in the records. Most of them were Eastern European immigrants, Polish, Hungarian, Italian, men who had come to Pennsylvania for the work that the coke industry offered, and who died in the dark, in a mine that Frick owned. No one was charged. Martha Howard Frick was born on August 9, 1885, as the first daughter of Henry Clay and Adelaide Frick. Clayton, the Frick family estate outside Pittsburgh in the East End neighborhood, was where she grew up. An 11-room house that Frick and Adelaide had purchased in 1882 and steadily expanded as the fortune grew. In 1887, at age 2, she swallowed a pin. The pin lodged inside her. It would stay there, causing infection and illness for nearly 4 years. She died on July 29, 1891. 5 years old. 1 week before her 6th birthday. Frick kept a locket with a lock of her hair for the rest of his life. He kept her room at Clayton exactly as she left it. A portrait of Martha appeared on every check he signed after her death. His great-granddaughter, Martha Frick Symington Sanger, spent years documenting what the loss did to him. The private world of grief running beneath the public iron will. Then, April 1891, 2 months after the Mammoth Mine explosion, 8 months before Homestead. The Morewood Massacre. 10,000 miners and coke workers in the Connellsville region had gone on strike in February 1891. They were protesting a proposed wage cut. They were demanding an 8-hour workday. They were asking for the basic conditions of a humane working life from the man who owned the towns they lived in and the stores they bought their food from and the ovens they drew coke from at $2 a day. In the early morning hours of April 2nd, around 3 in the morning, a large group of strikers marched on the Morewood Coke Works. Captain Lohr, a local dentist who commanded the men who met them, gave orders to disperse, delivered in both English and Hungarian. The crowd continued. The deputies opened fire. The death count from Morewood varies by source. Some historical accounts list fewer. The most detailed records list 9 men killed. Most of them were recent immigrants from Eastern Europe. Their names, as recorded on the historical marker at the site, and it should be noted that 19th century officials notoriously misspelled the names of immigrant workers, so these renderings may not reflect how these men spelled their own names, were Paul Dohanis, Valentine Zeidel, James Joseph Brockdo, Jacob Shukaski, John Fudora, Antonio Onderrist, Curso Kressinger, Joseph Klassman, Paul Galinsky. They were buried in a mass grave at St. John the Baptist Cemetery near Scottsdale, the same cemetery where some of the Mammoth Mine victims were already buried. In the same ground. Captain Lohr and his men were acquitted. The strike collapsed in late May 1891. Frick's response to the shooting was that it would have a good effect on the riotous element. So, by the time the Homestead strike begins in June 1892, Frick has already presided over a mine explosion that killed 109 men and boys. The death of his daughter, a massacre that killed striking workers whose killers went free, all within 18 months. That context is often separated from the story of Homestead. It shouldn't be. In June 1892, Frick moved. The contract with the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers was expiring. The billet market was depressed. Frick's new wage scale set the minimum at $22 per ton, down from $25. In a depressed market, this was a real wage cut packaged as a scale adjustment. He knew the union would reject it. He intended them to. He set June 24th as the deadline for treating with the Amalgamated as an organization. After that, individual negotiation, which meant no negotiation at all. The Workers' Committee proposed a compromise, accept other changes if the minimum stayed at $24. On June 25th, Carnegie Steel Secretary Lovejoy announced the $23 minimum would be enforced regardless. The negotiations were theater. Frick had already decided. He built the fence, a solid board fence, 12 feet high, topped with barbed wire, running the perimeter of the mill. Water cannons, sniper towers with rifle slits. The workers named it immediately Fort Frick. He locked the workers out on June 29th. He fired all 3,800 of them. The workers surrounded the mill, maintaining a 24-hour watch and shifts. They controlled the town. For a brief period, Homestead belonged to its workers in a way it never had before and would never again. Then, the night of July 5th. Picture what 300 men on 2 covered barges in the dark actually looked like. They had assembled on the Ohio River at Davis Island Dam, 5 miles below Pittsburgh, at 10:30 in the evening. They were a mixed force. Some experienced Pinkerton operatives, many others hired off the street in the days before the deployment. Men who had signed on without being told clearly where they were going or what they would face when they got there. Some accounts suggest they were told simply that they were being hired as watchmen. The barges were covered precisely so that no one on the riverbank could see how many men were aboard or what they were carrying. They were carrying Winchester rifles, lever-action repeaters with a 9 to 12 round capacity and a famously quick rate of fire, and they were being paid $5 a day for this work. $5 a day. The coke workers in Frick's Connellsville patches earned approximately $10 a week. The men hired to replace or suppress the Homestead workers earned $5 a day, half a week's wages for a single day's work. This comparison does not appear in most accounts of the Homestead strike. It should. It tells you exactly what the labor of threatening workers was worth compared to the labor of making steel. The barges were towed up the Monongahela in the dark, pulled by the tugboat Little Bill. The plan depended on darkness and silence, landing before anyone in Homestead knew the barges were coming, occupying the mill before the workers could organize a response. It was a reasonable plan, and it failed completely, because the workers had scouts on the river and signals ready, and because the people of Homestead had been expecting this move for weeks. The workers had been informed after midnight. They cut the barbed wire and stormed into the mill before the Pinkertons could land. By dawn, thousands of workers and their families lined the riverbank. Sources conflict on who fired first. The Pinkertons claimed the workers shot first. The New York Times reported on July 7th that the Pinkertons fired first, killing a worker named William Foy. In any case, the battle was joined, and once it was joined, it lasted 12 hours. The workers used what they had: clubs, muzzle-loading rifles, burning oil barrels sent floating down toward the barges, leftover fireworks from the 4th of July, 4 days earlier, and 2 small cannons. The Pinkertons were better armed. The workers were fighting for their town. Women on the banks of the Monongahela shouted, "Kill the Pinkertons," throughout the battle. This detail comes from Burgoyne's 1893 account, written within a year of the events by a journalist who was there, and specific enough to be credible. By early afternoon, the Pinkertons had concluded that the mill was beyond their reach. They had tried and failed to land several times. Their casualties were mounting. The men in the barges farthest from the fighting had given up and taken cover. A decision was made to surrender. A white handkerchief appeared from one of the barges. Someone on the bank fired at it. The handkerchief was shot through. What happened in the seconds after that matters. The battle could have continued. The shot that destroyed the first surrender flag could have been taken as a signal to keep fighting. Burgoyne's account describes a period of suspended uncertainty. Shouting from the barges, shouting from the bank, the specific held moment in which it was genuinely unclear whether the battle would resume or end. Then a second handkerchief appeared, and this time the workers on the bank accepted it. The parley was acknowledged. The surrender was real. Why they accepted the second attempt and not the first is not recorded. Perhaps the crowd had exhausted itself. Perhaps the person who fired at the first flag had been pulled back by those around him. Perhaps 12 hours of fighting had made the prospect of it ending more compelling than the prospect of more blood. That moment, one handkerchief shot through, one accepted, and the entire battle turning on the difference, is the most contingent moment in the entire story. The Pinkerton agents came off the barges and began marching through Homestead toward a nearby opera house that would serve as a makeshift holding area. What followed is documented in Burgoyne's account with enough specificity to make clear what kind of march it was. One agent, identified in contemporary accounts as among the first to come ashore, was beaten so severely that he could not walk under his own power and had to be carried the remaining distance. Burgoyne records that this man had been one of the more experienced Pinkerton operatives, not a street hire, but a veteran of previous strike deployments, and that his condition at the end of the march was worse than that of men who had been shot during the battle itself. Nearly every agent who made that march came out of it injured, many severely. The barges they had arrived on were set on fire behind them. 10 people were killed in the battle and its immediate aftermath, 7 workers and 3 Pinkerton agents. The 7 workers were Silas Wayne, John Morris, Joseph Sotak, Peter Ferris, Henry Striegel, Thomas Weldon, George Rudder. They are buried in Homestead Cemetery, St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery, and Verona. Their names are not in most accounts of this story. They are in this one. The Allegheny County Coroner's jury reviewed the deaths and placed blame on an unlawful assembly of locked-out steelworkers. The workers who were killed by Pinkerton bullets were, per the official record, responsible for their own deaths. 3 days after the battle, Father Boyan delivered the funeral address for Henry Striegel, Thomas Weldon, and Joseph Sotak. He called the Pinkertons not detectives, but Pinkerton rowdies sent to murder honest working men who have taken possession of the property to defend it, and to which property they have a certain right. He asked the congregation not to forget the men who had died, endeavoring to protect his home and provide for his family. Nobody was charged. On July 12th, Governor Pattison sent 8,500 Pennsylvania National Guard troops under Major General George R. Snowden. The plant was secured. Replacement workers were brought in. By November, the strike was over. Where was Andrew Carnegie during all of this? Scotland. He had gone to his Highland estate at the beginning of June, exactly where Frick wanted him. Whatever happened at Homestead, Carnegie was not there. He was in the scenic distance. What he was actually doing was writing letters and cables to Frick. Those letters are now in the University of Pittsburgh archives. May 4th, 1892, weeks before the lockout, Carnegie wrote, "We all approve of anything you do, not stopping short of approval of a contest. We are with you to the end." June 10th, 1892, as the lockout was beginning, "Of course you will win, and win easier than you suppose, owing to the present condition of the market. Now consider what comes next." This cable was written 17 months after 109 men and boys died in Frick's mine, 13 months after 9 men died at Morewood, 10 months after Martha died, and it was written the day after Silas Wayne, John Morris, Joseph Sotak, Peter Ferris, Henry Striegel, Thomas Weldon, and George Rudder were killed on the banks of the Monongahela. July 7th, 1892. Carnegie cabled from Pitlochry, Scotland. "All anxiety gone since you stand firm. Never employ one of these rioters. Let grass grow over works. Must not fail now. All anxiety gone." July 17th, Carnegie wrote privately to a cousin. "Matters at home bad, such a fiasco trying to send guards by boat. Still we must keep quiet and do all we can to support Frick. Silence is best. We shall win, of course. Silence is best." The man who had published essays arguing that workers had a sacred right to organize. Silence is best. November 21st, 1892. Frick cabled Carnegie. "Strike officially declared off yesterday. Our victory is now complete and most gratifying. Do not think we will ever have any serious labor trouble again." From Italy, Carnegie's reply: "Life is worth living again. Cables received. First happy morning since July. First happy morning since July. Not because of the workers who had died, because the strike had attracted bad press. And now, the press had moved on." Later in life, Carnegie would write in private that the works were not worth one drop of human blood, and that he wished They had sunk. He would carry the guilt of Homestead to his grave, by his own account. The cables are still in Pittsburgh. The dates are on them. Read them in sequence, and then read his later expressions of remorse, and decide for yourself what to make of the man. If you found your way to Ledger and Stone, and this is your first investigation with us, welcome. We dig deep into the Gilded Age, the families that built it, and the people it left behind. If this is the kind of history you want more of, please like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep making these. Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman were running an ice cream shop in Worcester, Massachusetts when the news from Homestead arrived. Goldman would later write that they were dangerously close to economic success when word reached them of the lockout at Carnegie's Homestead plant, and then of the battle on the Monongahela. They abandoned the shop. Berkman was 21 years old. He had been born in Vilnius in November 1870, had grown up within the fierce crucible of Russian radical politics, and had emigrated to New York in 1888, where he met Goldman, who would be his partner in politics and intermittently in life for the next 47 years. What he believed in 1892, with the conviction of a 21-year-old who had read all the right texts and not yet encountered all the right consequences, was that a single act, an attentat, a political assassination, could show the masses the ruling class's vulnerability and spark a revolution. The Homestead strike was the moment. Frick was the target. He tried to build a bomb first, based on methods from Russian revolutionary tradition. It failed. He switched to a revolver and a sharpened steel file, and something else, a capsule of fulminate of mercury, small enough to conceal in his mouth. Goldman and Berkman had $15 between them. It was, Goldman confirmed in her autobiography, Living My Life, barely enough to bring Sasha to Pittsburgh. He arrived in Pittsburgh in mid-July, stayed with local anarchist Carl Nold while he surveilled the target and planned his approach. He registered in the city as Rakhmetov, a character from a Russian revolutionary novel, a young man who subjected himself to extreme privation to prove his dedication to the cause. His cover, a fake business card identifying him as a representative from a New York employment agency, offering to supply strikebreakers to Frick. July 23, 1892. The Chronicle Telegraph Building, 5th Avenue between Smithfield and Wood Streets. Second floor. Frick was meeting with Carnegie Steel Vice President John George Alexander Leishman. Berkman bypassed reception by presenting his card and was waved through. He forced his way into Frick's office. Berkman fired. The first bullet hit Frick in the left earlobe, penetrated his neck near the base of the skull, and lodged in his back. The impact knocked Frick down. Berkman fired again. The second bullet struck Frick in the neck. Leishman grabbed Berkman's arm and prevented a third shot, possibly saving Frick's life at that moment. Frick rose. Leishman and Frick tackled Berkman. All three men crashed to the floor. In the struggle, Berkman drew the sharpened steel file and stabbed Frick 4 times in the leg before being subdued by other employees and a carpenter, who beat Berkman on the head with a hammer. Some sources cite 3 stab wounds rather than 4. The more detailed primary accounts give 4. When the police arrived, Berkman was chewing something. In his mouth, the capsule of fulminate of mercury. He had planned to detonate it after killing Frick, a means of suicide to ensure he did not survive the office. Contemporary newspapers claimed it was powerful enough to destroy the building. He had intended to die there. This was not an escape plan. It was a martyrdom. The plan had not worked. Frick was alive. Berkman was in custody. The revolution had not begun. A deputy sheriff moved to shoot Berkman. Frick stopped him. The doctors arrived. Frick refused anesthetic. He guided the doctors toward the 2 embedded bullets. "Don't make it too bad, doctor, for I must be at the office on Monday." The extraction took 2 hours. When it was done, Frick returned to his paperwork for an hour before going home. Before leaving, he dictated a statement to the press. 26 words. The chairman. I do not think I will die, but whether I do or not, the company will pursue the same policy, and it will win. The company, the policy, it will win. He had just been shot twice and stabbed 4 times, and he was still, in those 26 words, the chairman. Whether that is admirable or terrifying is a question most videos would try to answer. Both things are true simultaneously. Public sympathy shifted. The Amalgamated Association secretary moved quickly to condemn the attack. A union official said Berkman hadn't killed Frick. He had managed to kill the Homestead strike. The strike collapsed on November 20th, 1892. Workers voted 101 to 91 to return. They went back to 12-hour days and reduced wages. Berkman was sentenced to 22 years. He would serve 14. Martha Frick Symington Sanger, Frick's great-granddaughter, found documentation that Frick claimed to have experienced a vision of Martha, his daughter who had been dead for less than a year, in the moment of the attack. This is Sanger's finding, not established historical fact. A claim from a man who survived something traumatic, documented by a family biographer. Whether it is literally true is not the point. The point is that Martha was present for her father in the worst moment of his life, the way the dead are sometimes present for the living. Berkman served 14 years at Western State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, the same 14 years during which Henry Clay Frick was at the peak of his industrial power, driving Carnegie Steel's profits from under $4 million in 1893 to almost $40 million by 1900. One man was accumulating everything. The other had everything taken away. Both of them were being transformed by the institution that held them, one by the industry he commanded, one by the prison that commanded him. Berkman went in believing that prisoners divided cleanly into political prisoners and common criminals. Political prisoners were the persecuted idealists, men like him, punished not for what they had done, but for what they believed. Common criminals were parasites. He was the first kind. The others were beneath him. He expected to find, in prison, a community of the politically persecuted with whom he could commune in ideological solidarity. What he found was considerably more complicated than that. His early months at the Riverside location of Western State Penitentiary were a confrontation with the gap between his political rhetoric and his actual feelings about other human beings. He shared space with men he had, before his arrest, written off entirely. A professional thief, a confidence man, an old-timer tramp who had been moving through the criminal justice system for decades. Berkman, who had dedicated himself to the liberation of the working class, discovered that he found the working class when it was trapped in a cell next to him rather than marching in the streets, difficult to love. He writes about this, honestly, in Prison Memoirs of an Anarchist, published in 1912. He had spoken for the people. Now he was living with them, and they were not the people he had imagined. What changed him was not a single revelation, but an accumulation. He began cleaning cells, custodial work that put him in closer contact with other prisoners than any previous assignment. He watched the machinery of the institution operate up close, day after day, the guards' formal and informal power, the hierarchy of punishment, the way the system ground down both the people it imprisoned and the people it employed to imprison them. Daily, I behold the machinery at work, he wrote, grinding and pulverizing, brutalizing the officers, dehumanizing the inmates. The guards were being dehumanized alongside the prisoners. The dehumanization was not incidental, it was structural. He spent time in the dungeon, solitary confinement, complete darkness, the Pennsylvania diet of a daily slice of bread and coffee with vegetable soup twice a week. From the dungeon, he emerged with something he had not possessed when he went in, a a structural understanding of what prisons were actually for. Not rehabilitation, not punishment in any meaningful moral sense, something more fundamental and more honest than either of those. He wrote, "I had always thought of prison as a place where social distinctions are abolished, artificial barriers destroyed. But how different is this life? It is full of deceit, sham, and Pharisaism, an aggravated counterpart of the outside world. An aggravated counterpart of the outside world." Consider what that means, sitting next to the company town system Frick had built in the Connellsville coal fields. Workers who lived in company housing, who bought at company stores with company scrip, who lost their homes when they lost their jobs, who had no mechanism to accumulate anything outside the system that employed them. Berkman, cleaning cells and studying the prison's mechanisms, was describing a structure that Frick had perfected above ground in Pennsylvania's coal country a decade before the Homestead strike. The prison was the model. The company town was too. Same total control, same manufactured dependence, same punishment for resistance, different walls. He could not have seen that parallel in 1892 when he walked into the Chronicle Telegraph building. He was 21 years old, and he believed that killing the right person would change everything. What 14 years in a Pennsylvania prison gave him was a structural understanding of why killing the right person changes almost nothing. The institution persists. You cannot shoot an institution. He formed a small underground magazine with fellow prisoners Karl Nold and Henry Bauer. They called it Zuchthausblüten, German for prison blossoms. They passed it through the cells. They wrote essays and observations and jokes. They kept thinking. The prison failed to do what prisons are supposed to do. It did not break him or rehabilitate him or erase his politics. It educated him. After 10 years inside, he wrote to Goldman, "My youthful ideal of a free humanity in the vague future has become clarified and crystallized into the living truth of anarchy as the sustaining elemental force of my everyday existence." He was released on May 18, 1906. His first public speech after walking out of Riverside. What is a prison? A prison is the model on the lines of which civilized society is built. On the day of his release, he said, "I feel like one recovering from a long illness, very weak, but with a touch of joy in life." Frick was still alive, still wealthy, still buying pictures. 14 years had passed, and nothing the attentat was meant to achieve had been achieved. Berkman walked out of Riverside into the Pennsylvania spring with a clearer understanding of why than he had possessed when he walked in. The 7 years between the Homestead strike and the Ironclad fight were years of formal cooperation and accumulating fury that ended in the Ironclad fight. Carnegie and Frick continued to work together after 1892. The business required it. The profits were rising faster than either man had projected, from under $4 million in 1893 to almost $40 million by 1900. Under Frick's operational management, Homestead had become the largest integrated steel plant in the United States. The company that had been built on Koch and Carnegie's capital and Frick's relentless efficiency was, by the late 1890s, one of the most profitable manufacturing enterprises in American history. During those same years, Carnegie was maneuvering publicly to position himself as the man who had been somehow victimized by Homestead, rather than its architect. The essays he published, the interviews he gave, the carefully calibrated distance he cultivated from the violence that his cables from Scotland had explicitly encouraged. Frick, who had the cables, who had been there, who had done what Carnegie approved, and then watched Carnegie reshape the narrative from Europe, was reading all of it. The tension accumulated across 7 years in smaller grievances. Carnegie second-guessing Frick's acquisitions. Carnegie disclosing confidential bid prices to competitors. Carnegie making executive decisions without consulting the man running the company. Carnegie had told Frick directly in 1889, "Now I only want to know how your hand can be strengthened." By the late 1890s, he was strengthening Frick's hand considerably less and undermining it considerably more. During these same 7 years, Frick was building his collection with increasing seriousness and increasing resources. He had moved well beyond the Barbizon landscapes of the 1880s. In the 1890s, he was acquiring English portraits, Dutch masters, works by Turner and Gainsborough. He purchased his first Rembrandt in the early 1890s, not yet the magnificent self-portrait of 1658 that he would pay $225,000 for in 1906, but serious work from a serious artist, acquired through the Knoedler Gallery, which had become his primary dealer. By 1899, when the ironclad fight finally broke open, his collection was already among the finest private holdings in America. The Vermeer for $26,000 in 1901 was still 2 years away. The great acquisitions of the New York years were still ahead, but the direction was unmistakable. The man the loan officer had noticed being too enthusiastic about pictures in 1873 was now spending systematically and seriously, building something he had been building in his mind since before he had the money to do it. In December 1899, Carnegie called for Frick's resignation at a board meeting. Frick resigned without a fuss. Then Carnegie moved to deprive him of the better part of his wealth. His weapon was the ironclad agreement, a clause allowing the other partners to force him out at book value if 75% agreed. Book value was not market value. Book value was what the company's accountants said the shares were worth, based on assets recorded in the books. Assets that were deliberately kept conservatively valued to minimize the payout required when a partner left. Carnegie got the required signatures. Frick was offered approximately $5 million for shares that were worth $30 million or more on the open market. Frick refused, and then he sued. The lawsuit Frick filed threatened to open Carnegie Steel's books to public scrutiny. Frick's lawyers stated in court filings that the company's assets actually exceeded $250 million, more than 50 times what Carnegie had offered for Frick's share. Carnegie Steel was generating profits that Carnegie had kept almost entirely private from the public and from government scrutiny. Consider what public knowledge of those numbers would have meant in 1900. Carnegie was in the middle of constructing his legacy as America's great philanthropist, the man who believed that the wealthy had a moral obligation to give their fortunes away for the public good, who had already begun funding the libraries that would eventually number over 2,500 across the English-speaking world. His public image depended on the perception that his fortune, though vast, was being directed toward human improvement. The men at Homestead had been working 12-hour days on wages that Frick had cut in 1892. The profits that Carnegie Steel was generating during those same years, profits that Frick's lawsuit now threatened to place in the public record, would have made those wages look precisely as calculated as they were. A company generating profits approaching $40 million a year, while its men worked 12-hour days for wages that had been deliberately reduced. The arithmetic of that comparison, made public in a courtroom, would have been catastrophic for Carnegie's carefully constructed philanthropist image. He could not afford that exposure. He settled within weeks. Frick walked away with $31 million in securities, approximately $620 million in today's money. 1 year later, J.P. Morgan bought Carnegie Steel for $480 million to form United States Steel. Frick's holdings at the time of the formation were valued at $61.4 million. The two men never spoke again. In 1919, near the end of his life, Carnegie sent a note to Frick suggesting they meet. The messenger carried it to Frick's house. Frick's response: "Tell him I'll see him in hell, where we are both going." Carnegie died on August 11, 1919, at the age of 83, at Shadowbrook, his estate in Lenox, Massachusetts. He had given away approximately 90% of his fortune to libraries and universities and public institutions. He died widely admired. Henry Clay Frick died on December 2, 1919, at the age of 69, of a heart attack at his Fifth Avenue mansion, 4 months after Carnegie. In the same year, that evening, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were at a farewell banquet in Chicago, their last tour of America before being deported from the country that Berkman had tried to change with a revolver and a steel file 27 years earlier. A young reporter approached Berkman with the news of Frick's death and asked what he had to say. Berkman said, "He was deported by God. I'm glad he left the country before me." New York City, today. Stand on Fifth Avenue at 70th Street. The building is on your left. Indiana limestone, 3 stories. The facade severe and luminous in the Manhattan light. Inside, 16 galleries. Vermeer, Rembrandt, El Greco, Holbein, Velasquez, Fragonard, Turner, the Polish writer, and one of the final masterpieces Frick ever purchased, The Mistress and Maid, the last painting Frick ever purchased, a Vermeer bought in 1919. The room full of Fragonard panels, originally commissioned for the mistress of Louis XV, now hanging in the former home of a man who grew up watching his grandfather's distillery from a family that could not quite get close enough to it. The loan officer in 1873, maybe a little bit too enthusiastic about pictures. The pictures turned out to be everything. Frick died in December 1919, leaving the house, the collection, and a $15 million endowment to the public. The museum opened December 16, 1935. It remains one of the finest collections of European painting in the world. It has drawn over 1 million visitors annually in peak years. They stand in the garden court and listen to the fountain. They stop in front of the Vermeer, the one Frick bought in 1901 for $26,000, his first. And they feel what great art makes people feel. That is real. The art is real. Also real, 109 men and boys dead in the Mammoth Mine explosion, January 1891. Many buried in a mass grave at St. John the Baptist Cemetery near Scottsdale, Pennsylvania. 9 workers dead at Morewood in the early morning hours of April 2, 1891. Paul Dohanis, Valentine Zeidel, James Joseph Brockdo, Jacob Szukoski, John Fudora, Antonio Andarist, Serso Kressinger, Joseph Klassman, and Paul Galinsky, buried in the same cemetery. Captain Lohr and his men, acquitted. 7 workers dead on July 6, 1892. Silas Wayne, John Morris, Joseph Sotak, Peter Ferris, Henry Striegel, Thomas Weldon, and George Rudder. The coroner's jury blamed their deaths on an unlawful assembly of locked-out steelworkers. Nobody charged. The Frick Collection's endowment was $15 million in 1919. Frick's total estate was $145 million, approximately $2.9 billion in today's money. The workers at his coke ovens in the 1880s earned approximately $10 a week. These numbers do not resolve. They just sit there. Berkman spent 14 years working out why the institution that held him was a mirror of the society that built it. The total control, the manufactured dependence, the punishment for resistance. He came out understanding that the system is not reducible to the men who run it. It is a structure that outlives them all. Frick was a product of his system as much as he was its author. The company town preceded him. The prison preceded Berkman. Both of them were inside something larger than either of them could fully see from where they stood. That does not absolve Frick. It complicates him. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference matters. Eugene Debs wrote in September 1892, "All the bloodshed at Homestead on the morning of July 6th stains his soul." The loan officer wrote in 1873, "Maybe a little bit too enthusiastic about pictures. Alexander Berkman was deported to Russia in December 1919, 19 days after Frick's death. He died in Nice, France on June 28, 1936, ill and impoverished. Emma Goldman died in Toronto in 1940. Her remains were returned to the United States and buried near the Haymarket Martyrs at Forest Home Cemetery in Forest Park, Illinois, as she had requested." The Frick collection reopened after a 5-year renovation on April 17, 2025. The renovation cost $330 million. The second-floor family rooms were open to the public for the first time. The rooms where Frick and Adelaide lived, where the children were raised, where the private life behind the public iron will was conducted. Martha's locket is not on display, but her father's pictures are. That is what remains. All of it. The beauty and the blood. The collection and the names of the dead. The pictures that a 21-year-old coke operator in 1873 was already a little too enthusiastic about. The prison that showed a 21-year-old anarchist what the outside world actually was. What does it mean to leave the world something beautiful when you built it on something that wasn't? Stand in the garden court. Listen to the fountain. Look at the Vermeer. Decide for yourself.